Good morning. My name is Kemal Silay. I'm a professor of Turkish Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. And it is my honor to introduce today some of the leading scholars of Turkish studies in the world. We will have an exciting roundtable called Turkey under the AKP, or Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, or Justice and Development Party. Can liberalism and Islamism coexist? And our expert scholars here will tell us if there is indeed a possibility. I'm going to give 15 minutes to each presenters, and we will take your questions and comments. You will find our presenters' detailed biographies in the ASMEA schedule here, so I'm going to bypass that, except to say that the first speaker will be Professor Ersin Kalaycioglu. He is a professor of political science at Sabanci University in Istanbul. And second speaker will be Dr. Cüneyt Ülsever. He is a freelance journalist, columnist. Upon receiving his PhD from Harvard University's Human Resources, he started working for the daily Hürriyet and also author of a number of important novels. Third speaker will be Professor Sabri, Sayari, again from Sabanci University in Istanbul, and formerly the director of the Institute of Turkish Studies here in Washington, D.C. Last speaker will be Professor Birol Yesilada of Portland State University. All of our presenters have actually published quite a bit. They are some authors of some groundbreaking works. With that, I will kindly ask Dr. Kalaycioglu to make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much. After that much flattering, I don't know whether I'll live up to the kind of introduction Professor Silay has already made. I'll try to give you some insight about Turkish politics during the elections, comparing it with the 2007 elections, and also reflect the public mood as quickly as possible using these slides. I tried to develop a certain understanding of how certain factors coexisted and impacted the voting decision of the Turkish voters. My basic argument is that there are three major exogenous factors: religious and ethnic identity, which have become enormously important in explaining voting behavior in Turkey in recent times. Also, all forms of political behavior, in essence, even to a certain extent, influencing foreign policy. These two major movers and shakers determine more or less the ideological position of the voters on a left-right scale, and also their party identification. The latter with the influence of the parents' party identification of the current voters, and independently, there are also economic circumstances and economic expectations which influence the people's perceptions. There are two different ways of measuring this. This is a combined measure, both retrospectively and prospectively, how voters see the economy. And they scale always on the same dimensions. Therefore, I combine the two and look at it as one single variable, which operates independently. So religiosity and ethnicity mainly, and parents' party IDs determine party identification. Religiosity and ethnicity mainly determine ideological position of the voters, and economy and prospects about the economy influence their voting decisions independently of these other variables. And when you apply this to the data that we collected in the pre-election study in 2007 at Sabanci University with a colleague of mine, Kalaycioglu, this is the result that we get for the AKP voters in 2007. It has about 55% of the variance explained, and mainly we observe that religiosity is a major factor, ethnicity is a less important factor than religiosity, and economy also plays a substantial role in determining the party choice for the AKP voters. when you look at it at the end of 2010, in another survey that we conducted in December 2010, about 6 months before the election, we get almost the same kind of result for the AKP voters, 57% of the variance explained. And we have, again, religiosity as a major factor. Ethnicity did not seem to be playing as an important factor any longer for AKP voters. And the role of economy seems to have been slightly augmented in this case. Now, with the CHP voters, we have the same explanation. Again, it's mainly party identification influenced by two factors, deeply influencing where people stand on the religious secular divide and religious identification. The ideological position of the voter being on the left determined the voter to vote for the Republican People's Party. And although it's very slight, the impact of the economy, it's the negative expectations of the economy seem to have prompted the voters who are on the left to have voted for the CHP generally in 2007 elections. In the 2010 data for the CHP, we observe the importance of economy increasing tremendously. It is the second most important variable, and the same variables influence the voters' decision to vote for the CHP just as they did for the AKP, but only in reverse. Those on the left seem to have voted for CHP. Those on the right, those who have self-placed themselves on the right on a scale, seem to have voted for the AKP. And party identification continues to be a major factor influencing the vote, explaining by itself about half the variance in the case of the CHP vote. Another 14% is explained mainly by ideology and economy, economy being the second most important factor for the CHP. For the MHP voters, again, it's more like the AKP. They are on the right, on the left-right scale, so right-wing being right-wing results in voting for MHP also. Party identification plays the most important role. Negative expectations of the economy also seems to have resulted for the right-wingers to vote not for AKP, but the MHP. So if you're on the right, if you believe the economy is working real well, you seem to be voting for AKP. If you're on the right and if you believe that the economy is not working very well, and not for you, and not for the country perhaps even, then you tend to vote for other political parties such as MHP, but not CHP under those circumstances. And the same picture emerges for the 2010 vote. Now, if you look at the overall distribution of the left-right self-placement of the voters from 1990 until about 2006, these are, I present these tables in two different graphics so that it's not tremendously complicated. In 1990, about 22% of the people were placing themselves on the left, about 23% on the right, more or less equal. And the rest, about 56%, were placing themselves in the middle. By 2006, 19% were placing themselves on the left. Somewhere around 38% were placing themselves on the right. And this shift mainly occurred in 1995 with the end of the Cold War. And this same pattern held until the end of 2010. As you can see, on the left, there wasn't much move. People have been very much adamant to their left-wing position, but the left did not surge. However, the right seemed to have surged and continued on being the major determinant of the mood and the perspective and academic climate in Turkish politics. So there has been a right-wing shift and a new voter realignment as of 1995, and it is still sticking. So for one generation at least, we have considerable amount of being on the right. And this is the evaluation of the voters of the political parties on the same left-right spectrum. They systematically put CHP on the left, as you can see, and they systematically put AKP and MHP on the right. They have more or less the same position. In all of these, actually these are the placement of these parties by the voters, all voters, as arithmetic means. There is something around 2 to 2.5 standard deviation. Therefore, MHP and AKP may be considered as at the same ideological position. Kurds on the far left, very close to CHP, and that the other political parties are put in between these two positions by the voters themselves. So by self-placing these political parties and placing themselves on the right, there seems to be a huge advantage for the right-wing political parties. And the satisfaction with the economy, these are the 2007 pre-election figures, 2010 pre-2011 election figures. As you can see, with the impact of the economic downturn in the world in 2009, there was a big jump among those who argued that the economy is not doing too well for them. The pinkish line on the left, as you can see. But that dropped at the end of 2010 towards the former 2007 line, and more or less coincided with it at the time of the election. Therefore, the voters' perception of the government's performance of the economy was extremely positive as of 2011 elections. Personal satisfaction with the economy, the same story. And also for the well-being of the country, as you can see, in 2009 it was tremendously bad at that time and improved over time towards the 2011 elections. So far as the party identification picture is concerned, twice as many people seem to be reporting that they're identified with the AKP. There may be some kind of instrumental concerns over there, not necessarily hardcore attitudes, than they are with CHP. And about 1/3 of the people of the magnitude of CHP identification occurs for the MHP under those circumstances. Therefore, it seems as if AKP seems to have more party identification on its side, able to sustain itself. So for no other reason, you can expect the AKP to be the front runner in the Turkish elections. Major issues we debated at the time of the election, and that also tells you something about the mood, is about terror and economy, mainly. And the other issues, health and education, seem to have less of a role in determining the minds of the people. And in 2010, the second mentioned also corroborates the same picture. Two major issues, law and order and economy. And the most important priority of Turkey is also responded as law and order, and then followed by fighting rising prices, some economic concerns, protection of freedom or democracy or other issues seem to be a remote third and fourth. And finally, so far as the impact of this on foreign policy thinking among the people, popular threat perceptions in Turkey as of 2011, right before the elections, we did another study, and this is the election study. It seems as if now the majority of the people think that Israel is the most important threat to Turkey, followed by US, followed by the missionaries in Turkey, followed by minorities, followed by EU, which was previously in 2007 second major threat to Turkey, before Israel actually, which was third at the time. Iraq and Iran seem to be way down the list. And this also indicates that there's some kind of a correlation between where people stand on the religious, secular divide and how they respond to this question in total. Now, there are a lot of questions that have cropped up since the end of the election, and these issues that propped up, I will simply list them. I don't have the time to go over them, but there is a major debate over the Constitution now. We will get yet to see what sort of a Constitution is to be produced, if any at all. We don't know that yet. It's a murky process, but that's one major process that is determining the Turkish political scene today. And of course, the other is the time of the presidential election. We have, by referendum, accepted the presidential election, but we don't know whether the presidency runs until 2012 or 2014. If it runs until 2014, then we will have a jackpot election in 2014, for we have to have the local elections in 2014, general elections for the renewal of the Grand National Assembly's membership, and then presidential elections, 3 elections at the same time. Whoever wins them all will be the sort of hegemon of Turkey. And it will, of course, increase the stakes enormously. The losers will lose big, winners will win big, and that calls for a major conflict and a major confrontation. I'm not so sure whether Turkey can live happily after that election if the result turns out to be that way. Of course, we have the Kurdish nationalist issue and their claims continuing. The economy is increasingly coming into the limelight of politics. And of course, the ideological spectrum of Turkey may be changing very slowly in the years to come, but there doesn't seem to be much of a hint about that. I'll stop here. If you have questions on this issue, I'll get on with it later on. Thank you, sir.
I have an academic background, but more or less I'm a journalist. And I will make my speech from the perspective of a journalist living in Turkey. The question that is posed to us is, can Islam and democracy coexist? Honestly, I don't know the answer, and I don't want to make any generalization in this short speech. But the dancing of Islam and democracy in harmony is a very short story in the world, all we know. And if you want to make a theological study, you can easily find verses in Quran which encourages democracy, and also verses in Quran which discourages, negates democracy. So all I'll do is just talk about the experience I have gone through in the last 10 years. My answer to the question, under AKP government, is Turkey heading to democracy or liberal democracy? My answer is no. That is a very personal answer, but honestly, my answer is no. That does not mean that I want to say the government is not successful. We are facing a government which has won 3 elections, always increasing her percentage of votes. That's a big success in a parliamentary democracy. And in all cases, the government won the elections by applying pure democratic rules. Nobody can say that they cheated or they did something wrong. And I'm sure that in a country where 50% of the people vote for a government, for a party, that party is regarded to be sympathetic by the people. But I'm talking from a perspective where I don't feel that I have to be in agreement with the majority. Let me start to explain what I mean through my own experience. I have worked for Hürriyet newspaper, the largest circulated paper in Turkey, for 12 years. I was appointed during the military era, the so-called 28th of February era, 1997, 1999. And at that time, the prime minister was under accusation, was put into the prison. And I took a position in my paper as a columnist, thoroughly against the army, thoroughly in favor of the prime minister, in time when really it was difficult to do so. I even visited them in prison. I was put on trial by the military for 7 cases. A total of 49 years of imprisonment of mine was asked by the military rulers. And fortunately, I survived that era. Then my ex-friend, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan became the Prime Minister. And then after 2004, after he got the power, we started losing track of each other and ended up not saluting to each other when we see each other, because I was very critical of him for taking a very one-man show, a very tyrannic behavior. And he is one of the persons who hates most to be criticized. He hates people who criticize him because, well, if 50% of it is psychological, the other 50% is ideological, because he was a murid, a server, to a higher position for many years where he never had the right to ask or to question the person. Now he's the leader, he's the sheikh. How dare I question him? That is the way his logic works. And during his era, during the era of my ex-friend's prime ministry, large March, I lost my job. I was fired. Starting as of September 2010, the so-called the cultural columnist of the paper became the censorist of the paper. He would read the article I sent to him every day, and he would call me around 4 p.m., 5 p.m., and ask me if I may please change some of the sentences I have put down in the paper. For instance, one night when he didn't call until 7 p.m., I called him back and I said, look, I'm starting to have my Scotch whiskey. I may not give you correct answers. Please ask your questions now and then let me have my Scotch. And then there came a time when they said, you should not write 4 articles per week, but write 1 article. I didn't answer them. I sent my... Oh, well, I'm sorry. Meanwhile, before I was fired, 3 of my articles got lost on the way. Nobody called me, nobody said anything to me, but the next day when I opened the page, the paper, my article was not there. And when I called them, they said that it did not arrive to them and they forgot to warn me ahead of time. Another friend from another paper wrote in his column saying that does Cüneyt Ülsever send his articles with pigeons so that sometimes the pigeon loses the way. And then when they asked me to write once a week, I sent them an article. They refused to publish it. And then I resend it, and then they fired me. And in the letter that said, we are sorry to end your contract, they accused me for trying to revolt the readers of the paper against the paper. This is written there in my files. And the article was not published. It was not because of a published article that I lost my job. It was because of an unpublished article that I lost my job. But thanks to God or whoever, I'm not one of those 78 journalists who are in jail now. The day I lost my job, my wife said, I know, Cüneyt, you are unhappy today, but I'm happy because I know that by now, your probability of going into prison has decreased. That's actually what she said. A lot of friends of mine called me, and they said the same things. And alas, what is very dangerous about dictatorship or tyrannies is that it becomes normal. Many friends of mine called me and said, Cüneyt, you deserved it in a very polite way because you do not abide by what they say to you. So abnormality becomes normality after a while. And your friend who loves you very much can easily say to you, you should have done what your boss or your whatever editor-in-chief have said to you. So there are now 78 journalists in the paper, in prison, and they have been in a very cloudy way accused for helping terrorist organizations. But in the charges, there is yet any mention about any gun involvement, any organizational behavior, or any sentence they have said, you should revolt against the government. In fact, like my unpublished article, a journalist by the name Ahmet Şık is accused of his unpublished book. They have come to his office, confiscated his computers, and took out his book, unpublished yet, and said that you have been ordered to write this book by this terrorist organization who was attempting to couple down the government. There are so-called the Silivri cases, Ergenekon, and what do you call Balyoz? The sledgehammer case. And I have studied some of the charges there. There is very obviously, very openly put in charges there. You know, for instance, in a meeting done in 2003, according to the accusation, they talk about an organization which only came into existence in 2008. It's very sad in the so-called Ergenekon case that I know that from the old times, among those people who have charged, there were those who attempted, who at least thought about, who planned to do coup d'etat against the governments. But now they are either the 20%, 30% of those who are in prison, I don't know. So it has become a mixture of the cases. There are 2 people in the prison at the moment who applied to become members of the parliament in the last elections. They have been admitted to run for the elections and they won the elections, but now the decision among them is that, you know, they cannot serve as MPs because they cannot simply be released out of the prison. What's more, we had a referendum on constitution 2 years ago, and there the Higher Council for Judges and Prosecutors have been reshaped, and there would be elections who will be elected there. There came a list to be of 51 people. Tomorrow these people will be elected. And I published it, and I won by 100%. 51 of them won in the same order. So where is Turkey going to? Yes, Turkey has done a lot, thanks to the last government, to get out of military guardianship. But I'm sorry to say that, as some say in Turkey, we are not going on the way to advanced democracy. I'm going to say that more or less each day we are approaching more and more to the one-man show. So given his prediction about the coming elections, my guess is our next election will be in 2014. The constitution will be changed by then from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential system. Look, the heart of democracy, the United States has the presidential system. Why not us? After all, parliamentary democracy is not working that well. The present president will end his 7-year time in 2014. And we'll have the constitution changed by the mutual votes of AKP and the Kurdish party BDP. And my guess is BDP will have, as he demands, more freedom on the local governments. But at the central government, there will be the president who will replace the present government, who will take all the authorities into his hands. And then from that on, after 2014, we will have a presidential system which looks like more of an American democratic type, but which will be more squeezing us on the grounds. That is my the way I see the future. These are my feelings, and I'm just here to share them with you. Thank you very much.
Good morning. The topic of our panel is, can Islamism coexist with liberalism? But I was sorry, I was assigned the task of speaking on foreign policy developments. So I will start out with that. But of course, the bigger question for the panel is this one that was just mentioned. Now, we have had about 10 years of AKP rule in Turkey. That's a pretty long time to make a judgment on its performance. I would say the party's stay in power has had a major impact on Turkish society, on Turkish politics. The party now controls the government, obviously. It's the majority party there. It controls the presidency. It controls major cities, Istanbul, Ankara, and various other cities, and, and local governments. It has a fairly large popular support, 50% of the voters in the last elections. So we're seeing a party which is a dominant party. It has become a dominant party. We're operating in a dominant party system, if you want to use that term. And this has provided the AKP with unprecedented power in terms of policy-making processes. This is also true, of course, about the foreign policy picture. Turkey is different than the United States in the sense that the American Constitution divides foreign policy between the executive and the legislative branches. Both have a share in the policy-making process. In Turkey, we had three major actors. Previously, we had three major actors in foreign policy. We had, of course, the government, although sometimes we had coalition governments. The presidency's role in policy-making in foreign policy area had increased considerably after Turgut Özal's presidency. And, of course, we had the military playing a big role, especially on security-related issues. Now, what we have today is the presidency and the government is in the hands of the AKP, and the military is marginalized. This has been a process that has been going on during the last 2 years. So foreign policy is in the hands of the AKP, by and large. It has complete control, and of course it has also the accountability, the responsibility for what has been going on. The principal architects of Turkish foreign policy are two people, two men. One is the Prime Minister, Tayyip Erdoğan. The other is Ahmet Davutoğlu, Foreign Minister. And Turkish foreign policy today is largely shaped and colored by their own views of the world, their ideological orientation, their, I would say, religiously tinted lenses through which they look at the world. What have been the foreign policy objectives of AKP? I would say there are four major objectives which this party has tried to accomplish. First, to make Turkey a regional leader in the Middle East, and if you listen to some of the rhetoric, even a global power in terms of exercising its influence. Secondly, to use foreign policy to improve Turkey's economic development, to facilitate greater trade, commerce, and so forth, especially, again, in the context of the Middle East. Third, to maintain friendly relations with all the neighbors, the famous Davutoğlu doctrine or dictum of zero problems with neighbors. These three have all been stated in documents. They have been articulated in various policy declarations and so forth. There's a fourth objective, which is never stated openly, which is never written about in terms of foreign policy statements. And I would say, as I see it, is that fourth objective is to use foreign policy to shift Turkey's identity from that of a Western-oriented and secular country to one which identifies itself increasingly with the Islamic world and its cultural practices and worldview. We had heard lots of talks in recent years as to whether or not Turkey's axis was shifting, whether Turkey was going to move from west to east and so on. I think that issue is no longer really valid, especially after Turkey signed on to the radar missile shield system recently. That showed its commitment to NATO and West and so on. But what has shifted, or what is the attempt to shift, is Turkey's identity. And as I said, this is not part of the written and declared statements, but it's a process which is quite important. Now, how successful has the party, has the government been in terms of these four objectives? First, the question of regional leadership. AKP has spent enormous amount of energy and diplomatic capital in terms of trying to become more influential in regional affairs. There have been ceaseless number of trips by Davutoğlu, by Erdogan to various countries in the region, especially Syria. Last year I heard a talk from Ahmet Davutoğlu at Oxford University, and he said, I have been to Damascus 32 times in 1 year. Well, that's a large number of visits. Okay, so lots of agreements, signed agreements and so forth between Turkey and Middle Eastern states. An attempt to play the role of a mediator in regional conflicts, first between Syria and Israel, then between Hamas and Israel, then between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, in all of them Davutoğlu personally taking a major role. And more recently, of course, part of this regional leadership roles involve a confrontational strategy vis-a-vis Israel. So what has this led Turkey? I think, yes, it is true that Turkey has become more of a player in regional affairs. Its profile in the Middle East has risen quite a bit. From what we know, the popularity of Turkey on the Arab street has risen considerably. Turkey's so-called soft power making an impact there. But whether or not Turkey has in fact become a regional leader is of course questionable. There are many other candidates in the region that aspire to the same position. And I think countries like Egypt, for example, are not very happy to see Turkey trying to achieve this position of a regional leader. Plus, Turkey's potential regional role, I would say, is constrained by the fact that it is facing a huge big problem at home, which is the Kurdish issue. So if you cannot resolve your own domestic problems, how can you become a regional leader? That's a question mark. The second major aim of AKP, namely to use foreign policy to expand Turkey's trade and commercial ties. Of course, this policy is not new. Turgut Özal was the person who tried to use foreign policy as a tool for economic progress in Turkey way back in the 1980s. So there has been that tradition in Turkey, and AKP, I think, has benefited from favorable regional conditions in order to expand its commercial relations with the region. Some people suggest that this is in fact the main reason for AKP's growing engagement with the region, namely economic development at home. There is, of course, considerable amount of truth for that, but I won't say that's the main reason. The third goal, maintaining conflict-free relations with the neighbors. This is the zero conflict with neighbors policy. Initially, there was quite a bit of emphasis on this, but obviously some of these neighbors, for example, relations with Armenia, sort of fizzled out despite this initial opening. The main targets, I would say, were Iran and Syria. That is, Turkey tried to maintain very close relations with both of these countries. In a sense, it became an advocate of Iran in many regional and international issues. Of course, the most widely talked about one was the vote cast by Turkey in the UN Security Council when additional sanctions on Iran was under consideration. Turkey, along with Brazil, voted against this. So Erdogan, Davutoğlu, and others have been taking this very benign attitude toward Iran's nuclear development program. When they are asked, they will give you responses such as, well, we have been friends with Iran for thousands of years, our borders have not changed, we don't believe Iran will develop nuclear weapons, and ultimately, when they're really asked this question, they'll come up with something like, well, if Israel has it, why not others? This is some sort of a pat answer which has been coming out. With Syria, of course, this has been a very major change. It had been taking place since 1998, the rapprochement between the two countries, but AKP really put a great deal of emphasis on this. Numerous official visits, Bashar Assad and his wife showing up in Istanbul. They become the biggest shoppers at the covered bazaar. I mean, they're sort of, this very friendly, close relations. Last year, we even started having joint cabinet meetings between the two countries. Ministers from Syria coming to Ankara and Turkish officials going to Damascus and so forth. Of course, all of this was taking place while Turkey was ignoring the huge amount of repression that was taking place in Syria. Hundreds of political prisoners rotting in jails and so forth. Our government said nothing about all of this. On the contrary, there was this attempt to build very close ties with this regime. Now, by 2011, at this point, the zero problems with neighbors policy appears to have been a big flop. That's the shortest way I can put it, because Turkey at this point is having major problems with both of these countries, both with Syria and Iran. On Syria, it has become the foremost opponents of the regime. The opposition to Assad regime is now in Turkey, and they are being given a free hand to organize their activities and so forth. Of course, this has drawn the criticism of the Syrian regime and so forth. So the relationship has deteriorated within 1 year in an amazing fashion. With Iran, the relationship is also on the rocks. Iran has become very critical of Turkey's decision to host the missile defense system on its territory. And the regime in Iran is voicing its criticism directed at Turkey. And I would say both countries may be in the business of once again supporting the PKK against Turkey. The renewal of attacks of PKK activities in Turkey has something to do with this. We know about half of the militants of the PKK are of Syrian origin. So the Syrian regime might well again go back to its old bad ways of supporting the PKK against the government in Turkey. This business, this policy of zero problems with neighbors, I thought all along was a somewhat naive and ill-conceived policy, because how could you have zero problems with neighbors when some of those neighbors have major problems with your big allies? And that was clearly proven in the case of Turkey's relations with Iran, trying to improve them, at the same time Iran having big problems with the United States. And where does Turkey stand on these kind of issues? Now, on the fourth objective, namely the attempt to shift Turkey's identity, I think the government has really done quite a lot of work on that. I think this getting very close with the Middle East, okay, it has economic side, it has political side and so forth, but basically increasingly the government is posing Turkey as a spokesperson for the Islamic world, for the Arab countries and so forth. In a sense, Turkey is moving from its position of being part of the West looking at the Middle East, the other way around, being part of the Middle East looking at Europe and the West and so forth. So the leaders, the AKP leaders, I think, feel much more at home, much more comfortable at home in Arab capitals than they do in Western capitals. And I think they've been really using this foreign policy as an instrument to shift Turkey's identity. Let me turn to two other issues which are of major concern. One is Turkey's relations with Israel. The other, Turkey's relationship with the United States. Actually, the two are very closely interrelated. I've always told my students, my audiences in Turkey, that Turkish-Israeli relationship is not a bilateral relationship. It's a trilateral relationship. The third leg involves the United States. And unfortunately, this message doesn't get across very clearly in Turkey. But in any case, I think the AKP's approach to Israel, I would say, first of all, the party has never felt very comfortable in terms of maintaining the strong ties that emerged between Turkey and Israel in the 1990s. They did not raise serious objections to it until about 2004, 2005. Perhaps they were somewhat fearful of Turkish military's position on this, because Turkish military has been a strong supporter of Turkish-Israeli relations. But once the military was gradually marginalized in domestic politics, I think they become much more have begun to voice much stronger sentiments about their position on Israel. Now, as you well know, the conflict began with this famous 1-minute declaration of Tayyip Erdogan at the World Economic Forum at Davos in 2009, when he made this dramatic exit from the stage after accusing Shimon Peres. Then we had the flotilla incident in 2010, and so forth. And then a big amount of rhetoric from the Turkish side and also from some segments of the Israeli government. Some of my colleagues in Turkey think that this was all pre-planned, that Turkey was looking for an excuse to engage in this confrontational strategy because this would play for Turkey's audiences. We know from public surveys, as my colleague indicated, that there is this very strong anti-Israel orientation in the Turkish public at this point. So Israel bashing in Turkey wins you votes, perhaps. That might be one explanation. But I would say there is probably an ideological part of it. The Islamic movement in Turkey has always taken a very strong position against Israel. And people like Tayyip Erdogan, Abdullah Gül, all of them are disciples of Necmettin Erbakan. They worked in his parties, they served him, and so forth. So it's not surprising that they have come to this position. And of course, this business about leadership role in the Middle East. It makes Erdogan very popular among the Palestinians and various other groups. Where are we in terms of the present situation? I think the prospects for normalization of the relationship looks rather dim. Turkey has stated that there are 3 conditions before the relationship can be normalized. One, a formal apology from Israel. Secondly, some form of compensation for the families of the 9 Turkish citizens who were killed in this flotilla incident. And a third condition was also placed later, that is, Israel should end the blockade of Gaza. Now, I think when you heard that third condition, you immediately knew that this was a non-starter, that Turkey was really not in the mood to improve relations, because that condition obviously is unacceptable for the Israeli government. So I think this crisis with Israel is going to harm Turkey's relations with Israel, with the United States. Clearly, there is a sentiment here in the Congress on this issue that is of criticism against Turkey. So I think overall this will have a very negative impact in the short run and perhaps even in the long run in terms of U.S.-Turkey relations. Finally, I think on that issue, U.S.-Turkey's Turkish relationship, I think at this point there seems to be a good deal of cooperation between Washington and Ankara. Washington perhaps is sort of moving in the direction of cooperation with Turkey because there are some important issues. Exit from Iraq is one thing on which Turkey's cooperation is needed. Afghanistan is another issue. Turkey's stand against Syria is probably winning points for the government in Ankara and so forth. So from the American point of view, I think it makes sense at this point to have good relations with Turkey, although, of course, the legacy of the 2003 parliamentary vote still lingers when Turkey refused to accept American request for troop deployment through Turkey. This was a very strategic issue, and at a time when many people in Turkey were saying we have a strategic relationship with the United States. Well, how more of a strategic issue can you have if your strategic partner is asking for something big in time of war and you are refusing it? Obviously, this did not make sense. So that lingers on. And as an avid reader of the WikiLeaks stories, I've read a lot of things about how the American ambassadors in Ankara felt about AKP government, how Edelman and others. So there's not much love for this government, but I think the U.S. administration feels that it has to work with the present government, and that's why they're probably are on good terms. From Turkey's position, I think the picture in the region is changing rapidly. The strategic and security issues are becoming more important after a decade of more economic relations and soft power and so forth. Turkey is now facing very critical security issues. There is Syria, on which Turkey is really risking a lot by being the base for the opposition. There is the problem with Iran. There is the conflict with Israel. There is the renewal of the PKK activism. So we're moving back into the security-based kind of foreign policy issues after a decade of economics and trade and commerce. And for that reason, I think Turkey needs America's cooperation and support at this point more than perhaps what we had during the past 10 years. I'll stop here, and if you have questions, we can discuss them.
I'm Birol, Yesilada. Some old friends out there, greetings again. And as you know, I'm going to probably bombard you with some data. But here, a couple of things that I want to touch upon. I know we're running out of time. I started writing about Islamization in Turkey back in the 80s and promptly got myself in a lot of hot water when I was uncovering the ties of various Jamaat or religious orders to Gulf capital and entry of this money into Turkish economy during the 80s, and what kind of outcomes we had started seeing in terms of infiltration into the political arena and shaping the political landscape in Turkey, providing the basis for the rise of Islamist capital in Turkey as a competitor to the traditional, the Istanbul Western capital. And today we can say that Turkish economy is benefiting from the success of both. One tremendously tied to the traditional Western world, the other has opportunities in the south and extending into many which ways, giving Turkey the tremendous economic successes it has shown in the last 10 years. But at the same time, the political landscape is not showing the same fruits of what I would call progress along the lines of liberal democracy as I understand liberal democracy. As a political science scholar, I find it quite amusing when people argue that concentration of power in the hands of the executive and erosion of checks and balances between the legislature, executive, and judiciary tend to reflect progress along the lines of democracy. That's in fact flies in the face of what liberal democracy stands for. And I'm afraid Turkey is heading down that road of further concentration of power. And I don't care if it is AKP in power or any other party in power. When such erosion takes place in a country, that is certainly no good. But how can we explain the people's silence and acceptance of these developments? I think this map says a lot. It is based on World Values Survey, taken every 5 years, and the current survey is being collected this year. It should be completed by the end of the year, and we'll have an additional 2011 data added. This goes from 1981 to 2006, and I mapped the average of countries' people's values along two dimensions. As you go in the direction here, you're more secular, and as you go over here, you're more traditional and more religious. And this y-axis shows selfish survival values here, the me society. Sometimes in the United States, when you talk to old-timers about protection of the environment and endangered species, I come from Oregon. We spend millions and millions of dollars to save salmon. And sometimes you hear people say, people first. Well, that's over here. Okay, and over here to the top of the y-axis is the post-industrial values. More concerned about volunteering your time, paying attention to the environment, sustainability, the exotic ideas of sort, if you will. Look, most of the European Union countries are moving in this direction, along this line. More secular, more post-industrial. This is where Turkey is. Turkey, culturally, in its societal values, are way out of whack with the rest of the Western European countries and the United States. US is around here, right around where Spain is, if I were to map it. Turkey is out here. It's an outlier. Closest society to the Turkish society is Poland. Far more religious, a lot more religiosity, and a lot more survival values. Sort of the jump of the industrial era, if you will. As long as that is the case, you're going to see most of the people identifying themselves as being more religious, and fewer seculars. This party doesn't need to do much to win elections. The entire spectrum of the Turkish voter is moving towards the party. They don't need to do much. What they need to do is deliver some goods, like raise the gecekondu's, the shantytowns in Ankara, build apartments, and hand the keys to people. They did 500,000 of that. You know how many votes that brings you? A lot. And historically, the religious party in Turkey have been very successful in local administrations. But traditionally, they always messed up at the national level, except AKP. AKP is doing very well. At the heart of it is something else that's happening, and that is the rise in the power of the religious orders in Turkey, the Cemaatlar. They're influencing more and more policies of the elected individuals because they come from these religious orders. And there is this hierarchy in the religious orders. So what do we see in the liberal democracy and erosion of checks and balances? Executive branch is going to become the key. Turkey is indeed going to become a presidential system. Restrictions on the freedom of speech, as you have heard. We're seeing appointment of loyalists to all key positions in the bureaucracy and now in the military. I am one of those people who follows like the old Soviet watchers, who's standing next to whom. And I do that in the Turkish military, and I look at where they're coming from. And the recent reshuffling has pretty much resulted in appointment of top generals who are sympathetic to AKP and have close ties to either the president of Turkey or the prime minister. This reminds me of the post-Atatürk era kadro under the CHP when İnönü was president. Government will also decided that it reshuffled everything last year in the appointment of judges and state prosecutors, including the judges to the Constitutional Court, which now gives the president tremendous authority in determining who gets appointed. And finally, one thing that really blew me away recently was the decision of the government to appoint the president of the Turkish Academy of Science and also directly or indirectly appoint the majority of its members. So it's like our Academy of Sciences. Now, I can turn blue in the face telling you that liberal democracy in Turkey is eroding, but let's look at data from the experts who do provide a measure of democratization around the world. It's like the Freedom House. This is the Polity 4 data. And as you can see, Turkey from 1991 to today, 2008 is the less reliable data we have. It's probably around 6 or 7, has been declining. 10 is doing very well. And as you go down, look, you see here, Croatia is negative, and then going up to 1, and then getting better as it's getting closer and closer to European Union. There is a lot to be said to EU harmonization process. They lock you in, and if you do what they tell you to do, you're going to progress along the lines of liberal democracy. AKP approached the European Union to get what it wanted. And it takes two to tango. European Union gave a lot of promises to the Turks, particularly with the Cyprus issue, and then turned around and delivered nothing, and keeps asking Turkey to give more and more concessions. Of course, that's going to result in negative views in Turkey. But at the same time, the Turkish government has pretty much stopped the reform process along liberal democracy requirements of EU candidacy. Economy seems to be doing quite well in the macro scale when you look at it from outside. It's expanding, but it's overheating. I'm an economist. I look at it and I get very worried. There is a bubble, several bubbles in the Turkish economy, and if any one of them were to go, the one that I expect is the current account deficit. It's like a runaway train right now. And when that bubble hits, it could be an avalanche. And it's interesting that when dollar was depreciating around the world, it was appreciating in Turkey. And people were asking me, well, why is that? Why is the dollar falling everywhere else except in Turkey? Well, the current account deficit is out of line. Just past these, public opinion towards EU membership is at an all-time low. No surprise. And I'm going to jump into one last thing. I can answer questions later if you're interested. We do an analysis of any crisis or bargaining situation using nonlinear dynamic model for various clients. And we looked at recently Turkey's relations in the Middle East. There's a power convergence parity approach in between Iran, Turkey, and Russia in the next 20, 30 years. This is the global rise of China. You hear about it. When we said this in 1980, people thought we were smoking something. Literally, we showed this projections, and they said, no way. What the crucial aspect of this is when you reach parity, that is exactly when you can expect conflict if the two sides are not happy with one another or the rules of the game regionally or internationally. This is forecasting probability of conflict or cooperation between Iran and Turkey. Red means more conflict. And Russia and Turkey. Later down the road, you see, parallel to power convergence. But if Turkey were to join the European Union, balance of power disappears in this sense that it is no longer parity, and you have neutral relations. When we look at Israel and Turkey relations, interestingly enough, things are getting nasty. We looked at the current status quo, the relations between all the stakeholders within Turkey, within Israel, United States, EU, and regional powers. Their preferences on two issues. One is the state of relations between Israel and Turkey, back to normality of strategic alliance as it was in 90s, or break ties with Israel and everything in between. And the other issue was vote for Palestinian membership in the UN. And when you look at it, this is what you see. Over here is no relations with Israel and no relations with Turkey if you look at it from the other side. And this is going back to full partnership. Okay. After iterations of playing out the dynamics of who's close to whom, we come to an outcome that is dramatically polarized, extremely polarized. We are seeing a state of mutual opposition. There is a threat of bifurcation of the relationship, high dissatisfaction with one another, increasing instability in the region, and likelihood increasing over time of potential conflict. This is where we see all the Turkish players. That's where the Israeli players are. This is where the Turkish military is, somewhere in the middle, because they have such close dependence technologically on Israel right now. Okay, that's what's holding. This is time sensitive. 10 years from now, this will change. Outcome is going to be isolation. As the Turkish military gets weaker in foreign policy decision making, tensions between Israel and Turkey will increase. This begs the following question: what about the elephant in the room, the United States? I'm afraid some of the Turkish policymakers have convinced themselves that they can actually ask the United States to choose between Turkey and Israel. It's lunacy, as far as I can tell, but they actually believe it. I've talked to some of them last summer, September, when I was in Turkey, and they would actually argue with you that there is a lot of stake in losing Turkey. And I said, you really don't get it, do you? And it's very interesting. The day the Turkish government asked the Israeli ambassador to leave was the day the Turkish government also announced that it was going to permit the United States and NATO to put the radar installations in Turkey. So stick and carrot thing. But they don't realize the dynamics of US politics. They really don't get it. And that's, for me, is a very dangerous scenario. Because if when push comes to shove, there is no doubt who United States is going to support. And I hope that Turkish government will never come to the point of asking US to make that choice. Let me stop there. There's a lot more, but we can talk about it later.
Well, as I look at my time, we are perfectly on time. We're supposed to end right now.
Okay.
But David is very kind to give us a few more minutes because this has been such a fascinating panel, and I'd like that to be even more fascinating with your questions and comments. Yes, sir.
Two questions, please, and maybe a comment. The first question is Turkey a free country? I'd like to hear, I'm simply trying to combine what a bunch of you have said. Second thing, when the Turkish Prime Minister went to Egypt and spoke at the in front of the Egyptian Parliament, and he spoke, of course, in Turkish, it was very interesting to hear some of the reaction of Egyptian parliamentarians to him. Someone commented to a friend of mine, you know, he's telling us what to do. How do you think Jews feel when the Germans today tell them what they should be doing after what they did to us before. Don't the Turks remember what they did to us? Don't they understand that, you know, we are in Cairo, we're the center of the world. Dunya in Arabic, the mother of the world. Who are you to come and tell me? I really wonder with their Islamicism, do they understand, or their maybe attempts to take over the Sunni world and be the head of it, do they understand that people really don't understand the world as they do? Maybe one last comment, Birol, to one of the thing that you said on the Turks trying to convince themselves that they'll choose, that America will choose Turkey over Israel. You know, in the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire was losing, and the Russians were moving towards the Straits. And the Ottomans were deathly afraid, oh my God, we're falling apart. And then the British decided to come in to save the Ottoman Empire because they didn't want the Russians in the Mediterranean. And the Ottoman Empire went from, oh my God, to, and for the survival of the British Empire, we are the most critical element. And the Ottoman Empire, we matter more than anything. Is that sort of a variant of the same mentality? Thank you.
That's collective question.
Okay, I think we're gonna get all the questions first, and we will share them because we don't have enough time. Yes, sir.
I was kind of curious. Not many of you mentioned or you mentioned briefly the role that Kurds have in the coming future for Turkey. So my question is simply this: given the fact that the AKP has a radically different ideological perspective than its predecessors, do you think that that will negatively or positively impact the future of Kurds in Turkey and obviously the Kurdish movement regionally?
Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Morgan Roach with the Heritage Foundation. You mentioned that you fear that Turkey will lose the United States. Well, what if the United States loses Turkey? What then? Thank you.
I think we have plenty of questions to keep you busy for another hour, so let's keep going. Whoever would like to start, just
one by one.
Yeah, let's go.
On the Kurdish issue, I think I'm the one who put it up there as a major issue. There is a lot of confusion right now, no clarity. I don't think there is a government policy towards the Kurds right now. The government is both trying to negotiate with the Kurdish nationalists, try to cooperate with them or co-opt them into building the new constitution, but at the same time confronting them. And therefore there are certain irreconcilabilities in that kind of attitude overall. However, AKP is the most popular party among the Kurds. That should not be discredited. And at the same time, the Kurds are divided along the lines of religiosity. Those who are more secular and nationalists are supporting PKK and its front positions, and those who are Islamists are supporting the AKP, for they see that AKP is the only party that can deliver them anything among the lot of Islamist political parties and other right-wing political parties in the near future. There we seem to be standing right now, and we're coming closer to some kind of a negotiated understanding of where Kurds should be in Turkish politics. And a lot of violence is interpreted by some students of Turkish politics as the start-up to those negotiations, that the Kurdish nationalists try to enter those negotiations from a position of power or a powerful position. And the government is trying to somehow undermine their power to kill, to bomb, and what have you in this process. So it's a murky process for the time being. But this is not to be settled in a very short period of time in the near future. It will depend a lot on what kind of a constitution we're going to come up with. And that itself is, again, a very complicated, murky process. But there seems to be some sub-commission, as we call it in Turkish Grand National Assembly, which has started to work on the constitution. They haven't gone far now, but I'm not so sure whether that process is going to go on smoothly. It'll probably fall apart at some point in time, and we'll probably relive one of these constitutions by referendum that we had in 2007 and 2010, a replay of that, more or less. And that will not probably help much to get rid of some of these problems, especially the thorny ones, such as the Kurdish problem. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I'll take two questions. Is Turkey free? Is this glass full?
That's fine full.
Okay, thank you. If you are a person in Turkey not demanding a free mind, then from your perspective, Turkey is a free country. There are many so-called liberal columnists, academicians in Turkey who say that Turkey is a free country because we don't see anything the present government is doing wrong. But from my perspective, I don't know how much I represent, Turkey is not a free country. Has it been ever a free country? I doubt it. So it seems to me that the name of the game is still the same, but the players are changing. That's how I feel. About the Kurds, my feeling is the future of the Kurds will not be defined by Turkey. It will be defined by the United States, Iraq, the future of Iraq, northern Iraq, and all together. If Turkey can play a positive role in United States living Iraq, I think we will, towards PKK, Turkey will have a lot of gains. But my guess is, from the inner point of view, as I said before, in 2014, when we change the constitution, I think that the Kurds will get more local freedom in paying it for voting in favor of the presidential system in the center. That's how I feel.
Okay, about the question of is Turkey free, the organizations, various organizations such as Freedom House and others usually define Turkey as quote-unquote partly free, whatever that means. So that's the that's the position Turkey is. As far as Erdogan in Cairo and so forth, and the Egyptian reaction, well, you know, the current government and people like Erdogan and Davutoglu keep saying, you know, we know the Middle East best, okay? We know these people. The secular parties and their leaders, forget about them. They never knew much about the Middle East. We know it, you know. So I think they feel that they have this right, perhaps, to provide advice to the Egyptians. But of course, his speech in Cairo was quite a strange animal. I mean, on the one hand, you know, he talked about secularism and the need for secularism in the Middle East, which of course did not, you know, fit well with the Muslim Brotherhood people. They were expecting something else from Erdogan. So, I mean, if you ask them, yes, they think that they feel that because of this Ottoman legacy and all that, yeah, I mean, they are the big brothers in the region. They are in a position to provide advice, and so plus, I think overall, they have this exaggerated self-confidence. I mean, this comes out over and over in Turkish-American relations, in Turkey's relations, Middle East, and I would say, as I pointed out earlier, these people have the legacy of Erbakan and the Islamist movement. I mean, remember what Erbakan used to say. I mean, there's no surprise that Davutoglu's view of the world, or Erdogan's view of the world, is sort of Turkey is at the center of everything. You know, Turkey has the means to control a lot of things. Turkey can be a global power and all that. And this is part of that story.
Let me add a couple of things there. That reminds me, if you go back 20 years, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Turks rushed into Central Asia like the new big brother. Nobody invited them. And in fact, they did a lot of harm rather than good in the Central Asian republics when they had con men showing up as businessmen and literally playing these people. And that relationship, which is big euphoria and hoopla it started, fizzled. Fizzled to something that is more realistic today. It's still not very good. It could be closer, more harmonious, but nobody invited them to be the new brother. In fact, I remember the Central Asians saying, we didn't get rid of one big brother to have another one. The same thing could probably be said about the Middle East today. Besides, this whole idea of neo-Ottomanism, according to the fellows in AKP inner circles, I don't think they really understand what the Ottomans were like to begin with. And Ottomans, for the very small example, one thing, Ottomans always interpreted Islam differently. They wrote civil laws. They didn't run the empire strictly on Sharia. And they were far more tolerant towards others. And yet, what we see in the surveys that come out now, there is rise of religiosity in Turkey, but it's a really strange sense of religiosity that is very conservative Sunni and less tolerant. And it's not, by the way, against the minorities in Turkey. It's also against other Turks who don't have a religiosity like the AKP inner circle. Don't look too far. Just look at what's happening in North Cyprus and how much religious attack the Turkish Cypriots feel under the AKP. It's very interesting. So, my answer, is it a free country? Is Turkey free? On my record card, I would say no. In a country where you're afraid to speak your mind in your office, if you're a professor, because you're afraid that somebody is going to record you and then you're going to end up in some conspiracy theory, then, how can you say you have freedom? But if you say freedom is right to private property, yeah. I don't think we answered the question, has United States lost Turkey? I remember the article that came out a few years ago, who lost Turkey? And it's a very important question. I think the irony there is both going on. By playing to the cards of AKP for strategic or whatever reasons and looking the other way when rights of individuals in Turkey are violated and more authoritarianism is on the rise in Turkey, and you look at it from Washington and you say everything is going very well in Turkey and Turkey is marching down the road to democracy, you are offending a lot of liberal Turks, secular Turks, who are now going to not trust the United States in the future. So ironically, United States is losing its probably most important allies in Turkey.
With that, we will have to bring this panel to an end.
That's it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists one more time, and thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of this great conference. Thank you.
Teşekkürler beyler.